Okay. May regret having done this. We'll see. What sort of answers we're going to do. Who has a strategy you would like to share with class? Cold water plunge. Cold water plunge. Okay. Plunge yourself in cold water. Great. Okay. You think it works? Does that work? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Good. Who else has got another one? Yeah. Eat something cold. Okay. Okay. Eat something cold. What else we got? Jane.
Cold towel.
Cold towel, okay? See the theme in all of this, right? Cold, okay? What else? Okay. Sweat. Okay. Okay. Your strategy is to sweat. Okay. Okay. Go on. All right. That's fine. Good. Good. Okay. What else we got? Okay.
Wear light clothing, like
Wear light clothing. Okay. These are good. Okay.
I said like I stopped moving for like a mess.
Stop moving. Okay. Okay. That's an interesting strategy. Okay. Anybody else? What else do y'all do?
Shade.
Shade. Okay. Good. Anything else? Anything else? What do you do if it's hot and you get in your car? On the air conditioner? Okay. Does that work? For a minute? Okay. Okay. Anything else? Anybody do the what we will call the Gone with the Wind? Right? So okay. Why do those things work? Why do those things work? We'll hopefully tie ourselves back around to what we're going to talk about a little bit today. Why does plunging yourself in cold water work? You might know. Why does sitting in front of an air conditioner work? Why does stopping movement work? Okay. We'll ask those questions again at the very end. See if you guys have sort of fought yourself back around. So, anybody cold right now? Anybody cold? Okay. This was the only brave soul in class. So, like, no, he's going to make us do something. Okay. So, if you were cold, and we'll start off with all of this. Okay. If you were cold right now, what would be the single best thing you could do? Other than, say, putting on a coat or something, what could you do to warm yourself up?
Shiver.
Okay, shiver, exercise, right? All of these things. Okay, why does exercise warm us up? Okay, gets our blood moving. Yes. Why does that warm us up? Why do you shiver when you're cold? It's an involuntary movement. Why do you shiver? Yes.
Your body's trying to make you move so that your blood will be forced to the surface and like the heated blood that's in your body will, outside of things.
Okay. Okay. That's mostly correct. We're really close, guys, on the actual thing. Heat is the primary byproduct of metabolism, or at least an aerobic metabolism. Okay. So this is why we have to understand how we dissipate heat in the context of exercise. Okay. If you are cold right now, the best thing you can do is get up and start doing squats or jumping jacks or running in place. Okay. Muscle contractions generate heat. Like 60% of the energy created in metabolism is lost as heat. And so that warms you up. Okay? So when you raise metabolic rate, you also dramatically raise heat production. And as you raise heat production, core body temperature will go up. And you guys are going to hear me talk about core body temperature a lot today. Okay? Core body temperature is close to the same thing that we talk about, like if you guys think I have a fever. Okay? Even though a lot of times now, with the kind of advent of the forehead, swipe across your forehead kind of things, you don't really put thermometers under your arm or under your tongue very often anymore. Okay? But core body temperature is the inside. Okay? Inside. We'll talk about the best ways that are not pleasant to measure those as we move along today. Okay? But the reason we have to understand how the body regulates core body temperature is because exercise really warms us up. Okay? And if we don't have a way to sense that increase in temperature, and we don't have a way to rid ourselves of excess heat, then if we're lucky, all we'll do is fatigue and stop exercising. If we're unlucky, then we, in essence, will cook ourselves. We'll cook our brain. It kills the neurons. You go into a coma and you can die. Okay? So we have to understand we're really, 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 really good at thermoregulation. We're as good as any animal in some ways on Earth at getting rid of excess heat. Okay? Because of the nature of kind of what our aerobic metabolism is. Okay. Maybe this is going to go. There we go. All right. So, just like with blood glucose, okay, the homeostatic setting in the body is to maintain a relatively constant internal core body temperature. Okay. Most of you all are somewhere between 98 and 99 degrees Fahrenheit right now, which is roughly 37-ish degrees Celsius. The body wants to try and keep it in a small band or a very, very small range, kind of above and below that regular set point. And so as it goes up or as it goes down around that set point, certain physiological processes will automatically occur. And we're going to talk about those today. Okay? Internal body temperature. This is really, really important for understanding this. Internal body temperature represents the balance between what you're making, sort of the heat release from metabolism inside your body, and heat that is lost, okay, through a variety of mechanisms. So it's this balance. I'm making a certain amount, I'm able to dissipate or release a certain amount. So that's where we're going to settle basically on what our body temperature is. And so when you ramp up, making more heat internally, if you don't at the same time also ramp up your ability to dissipate that heat and get rid of it, your core body temperature rises. Okay? Similarly, if your core body temperature falls, you will likely start to shiver. We won't do a lot with exercise in the cold or anything today. But as you will start to shiver to raise heat production. There's this balance around the set point that we have to try to always maintain. Okay? That's what we're going to look to be. Rather than the scales of justice, we have the scales of heat production or heat gains and heat loss. Okay? So far I've talked simply about heat from metabolism. Okay? That's not the only heat that we are exposed to. Right? There is heat from your environment as well. Okay? So these are the two primary ways that we can gain heat. Okay? You go outside and it's hot. It's warmer outside than your internal body temperature, you're gonna try to gain heat from that environment, okay? You stand next to a fire, or a fire pit, or an oven, or something, and you can gain heat from the environment, possible. Okay? With exercise, the primary one is gonna be this, it's gotta be very, very hot outside for you to really, really gain a lot of heat from the fire. Then we lose heat, okay, and these are gonna be the strategies in a lot of ways the body is gonna attempt to employ. We lose heat primarily through 4 ways. And I want you guys to know all 4 of these ways. We'll talk about each one of them and mechanistically how they work in a few minutes. So it's radiation, conduction, convection, and evaporation. Okay. Now, of all of these, we're going to primarily lose the largest portion of our heat through evaporation. And we'll talk about evaporative cooling in a few slides. Okay. And then conduction and convection are going to be, in some ways, going to be our next kind of primary ways. We'll get into some examples of those that you guys have already mentioned today about kind of how and why those things might work. Okay. So you can gain or lose heat through conduction, and conduction is touch. Okay, touch. So everybody do this. Do Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid. Create some friction. All right, you guys feel sort of heat in your hand. Okay. Now take that and then put it on your neck. And see if you feel like your hand is warmer than your neck. Okay. Don't touch your neighbor. All right, without their permission. That's conduction. Okay, that's conduction. Physical touch. Physical touch. Okay. I'm hot, I touch an ice cube. I'm hot, okay. I get in cold water, touch. Okay, that's conduction. Can be very, very, very efficient if you can expose a large amount of surface area, a large amount of skin in order to do that. Okay. The problem with conduction is we have to get the heat from inside of our body out to our skin so that when we touch something that is colder than our skin, it can take the heat away. So we'll talk a little bit about how the body works to do that. That's conduction. Okay. Convection is movement of a gas or a liquid. So it's this movement. When you fan yourself, when the air conditioner blows air by you, okay, that is convection. Now, in some ways, right, if you blow cold air onto yourself or onto someone, we're doing a little bit of both conduction and convection. It's moving, so that helps, but it's colder than our skin temperature. So when the air hits us, we can lose a little bit in some ways that way via conduction. Okay. Radiation is the transfer of heat by infrared rays. This is sort of one of the ways that we lose a lot of heat while you're sitting there. You ever sat down next to this when it's cold outside like this, like next to somebody, and like they've been exercising or something, you can like just feel the heat sort of coming off of them, right? That's radiation. Okay. That heat is leaving their body via radiation. Okay. And then evaporation is the process that we sweat. And then as that we warm the sweat up, or the outside air is still warm, then that when it evaporates, when the water from the sweat evaporates, it takes heat away and we get cooling in that particular way. So at rest, we're losing a lot of our heat via radiation. During exercise, the primary way that we lose our heat is via evaporative cooling. Okay. And we'll talk about why that's good, but also why that's bad, and how some environmental factors are going to play big roles in all of this. Okay. Some terms that we need to know. Hyperthermia is an elevated body temperature. Okay. If you have a fever, you have hyperthermia. Okay. Hypothermia is a decrease in body temperature. Okay. You sat outside today, we went and dunked you in some water and had you sit outside for a while, you might get hypothermia today. Okay. It's probably not quite cold enough that that would be a really, really terrible thing, but if it was a little bit colder, we could. Okay. As I said, heat moves from the inside of the core out to the skin, and then we try to lose it from there. Okay, and a lot of the heat transfer in our body is through conduction. Okay, you warm up the muscles, the heat gets transferred to the blood that's moving around. You get a little bit of movement. The blood moves. As it moves around, it transfers the heat from the blood into the blood vessels, out to the skin. Don't move that way. Okay? All right. Questions about that? Think about the things you wrote down. Here's how you wanted to cool yourself off. And think about all of those in the context of these four things. Okay? Which one is radiation? Which one is evaporation? Most of the things that you guys were discussing were conduction and convection related, okay? When you're not exercising, you're thinking of kind of artificial ways to lose heat, it's mostly conduction and convection. Okay? All right. So let's, because it's the most important one during exercise, let's spend a few minutes talking about evaporation. Okay. Evaporation is very, very efficient, but you're not sweating right now. Most of you, right? You're not sweating right now. We can probably change that. Or we could probably stress somebody out or make them exercise and do some of those things. But there's a trigger. At rest, we don't make a lot of sweat. And what happens is, as the body temperature rises, as core temperature rises from exercise or stress or something, then it's going to trigger the sweating response. Right? It triggers the production of sweat from the sweat glands that are in your skin. Okay? That sweat then moves from in the skin out to the surface of your skin. It can evaporate and become water vapor. And as it does that, it pulls some heat away with it. Okay? So evaporation accounts for about 80% of heat loss during exercise. About 80%. So it is by far the largest way we lose heat during exercise. It's only about 20% at rest. And a lot of what you guys experience at rest, you don't even realize you're making sweat. It's what we call insensible water loss in that way. Okay? So we get evaporation of water from breathing, from inside of our lungs, right? A little bit from your skin and those things. You don't even know that it's happening. Okay? So there's about 10% of our heat loss that is constant from this insensible sweating or insensible water loss. Okay? Because sweating is so important, we have to understand and appreciate how water transitions from fluid on your skin to water vapor in the air. Okay? To water vapor in the air. And so on a day like today, it's pretty easy to have sweat evaporate. Okay? Because there's very little water vapor in the air. Okay? There's very little water vapor in the air. Let me do the most dad thing ever and pull up the Weather Channel app. And we will see what the relative humidity outside is right now. It is how many humidity? Oh. What do you know where I find humidity? Ah, okay. They're forecasting it to be 65% today. Okay, 65%. A little higher than what I was thinking. But there's a certain amount of water vapor in the air. That's humidity. Okay. You guys have all had the experience, right? You go out, it's August, you get up first thing in the morning, it's kind of like you're in a cloud outside. It's already like 80-some degrees, but it's like you can just feel the humidity and everything. And it makes that 85-degree temperature feel hotter or worse than it would if anybody, you guys have ever been like to Sedona or you've been to the desert or any kind of places, right? Where it's very, very dry. Okay, it's very dry, very little humidity. What happens is there's a gradient between the amount of water vapor in the air and sweat. Okay, the less water vapor there is, the less water there is in the air, the easier it is for sweat to evaporate. And then you have to have the evaporation to get the cooling. So when there's lots of water vapor in the air, when humidity is very, very high, it's much more difficult for sweat to begin to evaporate. Okay, because that gradient is so small. And therefore, when it's really humid, you lose much less heat via evaporation, or it's much more difficult to lose heat via evaporation. And we'll talk about the role that plays in understanding environmental stressors and environmental things to be wary of if you're going to exercise. Okay. Okay. So here is heat removal from the skin. You can see all of that. We talked about humidity. Okay. So we'll do the bad part first here. Talk about how we assess temperature. Okay. So in order for us to understand what kind of heat stress you may be under or what's happening, you need to be able to measure your core temperature. Okay. A lot of things now, we will take what's called tympanic temperature. That's the temperature from inside your ear. Okay. I can tell you, as a parent of a toddler, we check Ellis's temperature like once a week. All thermometers suck. Okay, they're all bad. We need one of those like infrared guns that you like point at them, that you can use if you're grilling or something to get a better idea. Ear temperature is better than skin temperature. So what I will tell you guys is temperature on your skin, because of convection, conduction, evaporation, skin temperature is going to be lower than core body temperature. And it's the core temperature that is going to tell us something about the kind of actual heat stress that we're going to be under. Okay, so you can measure it by putting a probe on the skin, but you're going to get lower numbers than all of these. So ear is fine. Oral is better. Thermometer in your mouth. Okay, put it under your tongue, which is also super fun if you have a toddler because they can't sit still and do anything for more than about 10 seconds. Okay, oral temperature is better. The two best ways to measure core body temperature are by taking a rectal temperature or by taking what we call an esophageal temperature. Okay. Now, some of you may have had when you were little, they don't often do it to adults because you can do oral, but you can, or maybe you've done it on one of your cat or a dog. If you take them to the vet, they'll take a rectal temperature. They just stick a thermometer in the booty and they'll measure the core temperature that way. Okay. Now, we can do this in you guys while you exercise. Okay. And I can tell you that while we're exercising, I'll show you guys a bunch of data later on. And most of the core body temperatures that you guys see in all of that come from measurements of rectal temperature. Okay. Esophageal, to measure esophageal, we need to be able to get down sort of right on top of your Adam's apple. And so to measure this one, we snake a thermode up your nose, back down your mouth, down and sit sort of in the back of your throat in those ways. Now, someone that, because we had a lab when I was a PhD student at Georgia, that this is what they studied, right? They studied environmental stressors on exercise performance, core body temperature, all of these kinds of things. Having had all of these things done by volunteering for things, the rectal one's better. The esophageal thing is like the worst thing in the entire world because it's terrible. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys a bunch of data. Most of it's going to be for measures of rectal temperature, sort of later on. Okay. All right. So as we said, core body temperature roughly around 37 degrees. Skin temperature is about 35 degrees. Okay. During exercise, core temps can approach or in some instances exceed about 40 degrees Celsius. About 40 degrees. Once it gets over 40, we're likely going to begin to experience some central fatigue, and the body's going to start sending out some kind of alarm system. So imagine your core body temp is going to end up being somewhere north of about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay. If we measure it by sticking little thermodes directly into the contracting muscles where the metabolic heat is being given off, it may exceed about 42 degrees Celsius. Okay. So as we move it from the muscles away, it's going to cool a little bit. As I said, anything above 40, and we can start getting into trouble. Okay, we can start getting into trouble. I can tell you guys that one of the scariest things when you have kids is when the doctor says, they got 102 temperature, they're fine. Don't give them, they don't need any Tylenol, they don't need any ibuprofen. Just, let them basically, it's fine, right? And so I can remember when Ellis was tiny for the first time she had a really, really bad sort of respiratory infection. She's like 103 or something. We were, of course, calling our pediatrician. We're like, yeah, it's fine. Whatever. No big deal. Okay. They see a lot of stuff. And so don't worry. Part of it is because of things like this. Okay. Like you can exercise and you can get up to 104. You got to get a little bit above that before you really, really have like kind of chances of there being actual sort of neurological problems and damage. Okay. All right. So those are kind of our targets. All right. So how do we regulate body temperature around that 37 degrees set point? Well, the big thing that we do is there are going to be receptors in the hypothalamus, okay, that are going to sense. We have brain receptors that sense the temperature of blood. So the hypothalamus is in essence our thermostat, okay, and it tries to maintain all body temperature around that 37 degrees of set point, okay. We have both central and peripheral thermoreceptors. Central are located in the hypothalamus, and then peripheral are located in the skin. And both of them are going to monitor temperature in the skin, temperature in the blood circulating through your brain. Okay. When we sense an increase in temperature, the hypothalamus will then send out signals to move where blood is going to try to help us dissipate heat. If temperatures are low, the hypothalamus will send signals to the motor cortex and tell us to begin to shiver and try to raise core body temperature. Right? So if we do things that might affect the ability of either these central or peripheral thermoreceptors to function, then things can get out of whack. Okay? And sometimes that will happen. There are people that don't sense these things correctly, or they get kind of the wrong response on these kinds of things. For example, okay, when I was a PhD student, I think I've mentioned this, we did a lot of research on people with spinal cord injuries. And one of the common things with people with spinal cord injuries was because of the damage in the spinal cord, they couldn't get all of the signals they needed from their peripheral thermoreceptors. And so they were not very good at thermoregulating. And so if you were ever going to exercise them, we did a project where we actually sort of put heating pads on their legs in an effort to try to stimulate something called heat shock protein, which there's evidence that if you activate heat shock protein, which all of us do during exercise, that it might lead to hypertrophy. So we were thinking, like, if we just warm these people up, right, might we prevent some muscle atrophy and things in them? But you had to be really, really careful because they didn't necessarily get the correct sweating response. And part of it is the receptors. The other part is that the way the hypothalamus signals through the sympathetic nervous system to send blood to the skin didn't work very well in them as well. So you may encounter people that have some problems with all of this, okay? Okay. So let's just say, for example, you're exercising. You're making heat in your muscles. It's getting transferred to your blood. That blood is going to circulate around. Skin temperature increases. Blood temperature increases, so it's picked up by the central receptors. The body senses and understands core body temperature is going up. What do we do now? Okay. Well, there are these what we call effector organs. These are what the hypothalamus is going to signal to in order to try to change where blood flow is going primarily and try to help us dissipate heat. Okay? So the primary one is sweat glands. You sense an increase in core body temperature, sweat glands get stimulated, they begin to produce sweat. Okay? You guys will see a thing that happens as you become accustomed to the heat. You actually sweat at a lower core body temperature. You can reset what the needed temperature is to stimulate that with some acclimatization. Okay? It also sends signals to smooth muscle and therefore the arterioles. This is primarily through epinephrine and norepinephrine. As you warm up, you will vasodilate smooth muscle on arterioles that lead to the skin. Okay? That's going to send more blood to the skin to put it into close contact so that convection and conduction can increase, and then also help to further hit those skin receptors and drive sweat. Okay. The problem that happens with this is that as blood goes to the skin, it's not going to skeletal muscle. You will see in a few slides, increasing core body temperature hampers exercise performance. And one of the reasons that it does is that you've got blood going to the skin, therefore it's not going to your muscles. So you cannot get as much of your cardiac output to skeletal muscle when it's hot outside as you can when it's a thermoneutral environment. Okay. Okay, we're also going to get stimulation to skeletal muscle. When you're cold, it's going to tell it to shiver. When you're hot, it's not gonna do a lot until you get very, very hot. At some points, the hypothalamus will tell the motor cortex, we're too hot, stop moving, stop contracting. You're making too much heat. That's a strategy, okay? Just like what Jake suggested earlier. When you're hot, don't move. You're not gonna make as much heat. That will help you in some ways. We're also gonna signal to endocrine glands, right? We're going to get some hormones that can increase metabolic rate, T3, T4, those kinds of things. All right. And we can get some heat production. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, maybe it's the same kind of effect. So these two, sweat and smooth muscle, are the primary ways we get rid of heat, and then telling skeletal muscle to contract and shiver, and then releasing certain hormones, thyroid, and then epi and norepi may help us actually warm ourselves up a little bit as well. Okay. Okay, so this just shows the things that we've talked about kind of in a cartoon, right? You get an increased core temp that activates the hypothalamus, which then sends blood flow to the skin, right? Which is then going to decrease body temperature, right? And we're also going to get sweat, and both of those things together are going to bring our temp down, which then will stimulate the hypothalamus to stop sending blood to the skin and stop evaporative cooling. Okay. Okay, so we've all probably had this experience, and so we're going to get into the physiology of why this is the case, right? If I told you you have to go and exercise, would you rather do it when it's 100 degrees outside, or today, right now, when it's about 35? Right? You're probably going to perform better today. You can get over the coolness, right? And overcome all of that. And so the things that we do in the cardiovascular system to help us dissipate heat are very likely going to lead to competition for blood, which means there's less blood going to skeletal muscle, which means the cardiac output getting there is going to go down, which means potentially the AVO2 is going to go down. So you can't get as much blood, so you can't extract as much oxygen. So when it is hot outside and it feels more difficult to exercise, that's because heat artificially lowers your VO2 max, right? Because it artificially lowers your cardiac output because you can't get all of it to go to skeletal muscle, okay? So what we tend to see when it's hot, okay, is that stroke volume decreases. This is the primary initial thing. Blood flow goes to the skin. If it's going to the skin, it's not at skeletal muscle. And if it's not at the skeletal muscle, then the muscle pump doesn't work quite as well. Okay? So stroke volume falls in exercise and heat because of the decrease in venous return, and therefore a decrease in preload. Okay? So if your stroke volume at any given point in time falls, to maintain cardiac output, heart rate has to increase by necessity. And so what we see in exercise in the heat, for most people, once you've warmed up a little bit, is you see an elevated heart rate at any given exercise intensity compared to what it would be in a thermoneutral or a cool environment. Okay? This phenomenon, this decrease in preload that pulls stroke volume down, and the corresponding increase in heart rate to maintain cardiac output is called cardiovascular drift. of cardiovascular drift. And this is the primary reason that it feels more difficult to exercise when it's very warm out. Okay? When you get hot enough, the brain may be like, we're uncomfortable, we're approaching 40 degrees Celsius, we need to stop. But as long as you're not getting to that point, the reason it feels more effortful is because your VO2 max has gone down and now running at 7 miles an hour is at 80% of max instead of at 70%. Okay? So eventually we can no longer compensate for the increasing demands and performance has to decrease. And performance has to decrease. Okay. So let's talk about one way as well over time that we can exacerbate this loss of stroke volume. Okay. So if you get some, because there's decreased venous return and decreased preload, it can become exacerbated over time by sweat loss. Okay. When you sweat, the vast majority of that fluid comes from the plasma, the blood. So if you sweat a lot, your blood volume will decrease. So I have less blood, that's going to lower preload as well. It's going to lower venous return, that's going to further lower stroke volume. So what happens is you start off with, I send more blood to my skin, therefore that's going to lower venous return. It's not all around the muscles that are contracting to get pushed back. Then you begin to sweat, and so it becomes like a double whammy. The overall amount of blood drops because plasma is being lost via sweating, plus it's still going to the skin, so I'm getting less muscle pump effect. So I get this kind of double whammy, stroke volume falls. Okay? We sweat about 1 liter per hour per square meter of body surface. Okay? I meant to look up how many square meters of body surface area a typical person has, right? But you can lose, and this is very, very common, anywhere between about 2 to 3% of your body weight via sweating during kind of hot environment, relatively heavy exercise, very easily. Okay, it's not uncommon to see people that are down 4 or 5% of their body weight. Okay, you guys see if you think about these kinds of things. Montana, do they weigh the football team before and after every practice when it's hot? Yeah, they do. Okay. So one of the ways that you track all of this is you have to track body weight. Okay. And so in a lot of instances, they may do it with soccer girls. If you're going to exercise when it's hot outside, we need what is essentially, okay, dry clothes, sort of the better way probably is to take nude body weight. And then what is it before practice? You go out, you sweat a bunch, you do things, come back in, get that weight again, and we can measure basically how much weight you've lost. And from that, we can infer probably how much sort of plasma volume or sort of water loss we're getting from that. So really, really important because we need to replace that fluid. We need to drink water or Gatorade or Powerade or something to replace that fluid. Okay, both to maintain performance in the moment, but also to recover for the next day. Okay. As the sweat happens, though, we also lose minerals and electrolytes. So plasma has salt in it, while your sweat is salty. So one of the things you got to be careful about when you're trying to rehydrate is how much sodium and potassium and things need to be in the fluid that I consume. There's a lot of research that's going into a bunch of that. We'll get to that a little bit later. But as you sweat and you lose water, you release aldosterone, an antidiuretic hormone that's going to lead to both thirst, but mostly to hanging on to both water and sodium. Okay. If you are dehydrated and you go to urinate, your urine will be more yellow. Okay? Because it's holding on to water, you're making less urine volume, so it becomes more concentrated. Okay. They will sometimes say you need to drink enough every day so that your urine is relatively clear. That's a reasonable guide on a lot of different things. But there's different reasons why it might not be clear. But for the most part, kind of you want to make sure you're sort of rehydrating really, really well. Okay. Okay. So in that context, then, I need you guys to appreciate that exercising when it's hot is inherently more dangerous than exercising when it's kind of cooler out or cold before it gets really, really cold. Okay. There are what we call heat illnesses, right? You can get heat cramps, you can have heat exhaustion, you can have a heat stroke, very, very dangerous. Okay. So excessive heat gains can kill you. Okay. So if we want to understand what's happening in a particular environment, outside for the most part, okay. Although to be honest, if people are working in warehouses, other kind of working conditions, this is right back to what the initial Harvard fatigue lab stuff in the 20s was trying to understand, right? What are the effects of the environment, heat stress and things on working conditions? We have to consider air temperature. We have to consider humidity or the water vapor in the air. We have to consider if there's wind. And then we have to consider the amount of sort of thermal radiation, which may be controlled by, like, what are you exercising on? Are you in a blacktop parking lot? Are you on grass? Okay. There can be some differences because of all of those things. And so one of the ways that we try to understand all of this is by looking at something called wet bulb globe temperature. Simply knowing how hot it is outside is not sufficient for us to understand the true heat stress that you might experience on that day. And so wet bulb globe is going to have sort of a thermometer that is going to be placed over sort of some water to see kind of what is the ability of this water to evaporate. Okay, it's measuring air temperature. It's got what's called this sort of globe temperature up here. It also is going to measure, usually it's a thing to measure wind speed. So we're trying to account with this for the ability on a given day to lose heat via evaporation, to lose heat via conduction and convection, but also what's the possibility we may be gaining heat via radiation and some other things as well. Okay. So you don't have to know this equation, but wet bulb globe temperature is basically a number that scales like regular sort of temperature. And it's taking 10%, okay, of what we call dry bulb temperature. So that's with air temperature. Okay. It's 70% of the wet bulb temperature, which is going to tell us sort of the capacity to evaporate. And then it's 20% the black globe, which is going to tell us what's happening from radiated heat based upon cloud cover, based upon what is sort of the environment in which you're exercising. Okay. So you put all of those together and you can see that it most heavily weights water vapor. Okay. Humidity is way more important to determine thermal stress on a given day than actual air temperature. It really all comes back to humidity. Weirdly enough, we tend to see way more heat illness in kind of what you might think of as moderately warm days when it's very, very humid in comparison to super, super hot days, right? 87 to 88 degrees and 95% humidity is a worse thermal stress than 105 and 20% humidity. Okay. And there's two reasons. One, it's because you can't lose heat via evaporation, but also when air temp is down and it's not super hot, people don't think and don't need to drink quite as much. So we've got to be really careful about what all of these things are. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to show you all a little bit of data about the triggers for sweating, and again, why the wet bulb temperature is going to be so so important. Okay. So think about this. If you expended 10 calories per minute, okay, 10 calories per minute, it's not very many. Okay. It's about 100 calories in a mile. So whether you walk it or run it, so this is about you are jogging at about 10 minutes per mile pace, so not particularly fast. If you did not dissipate any heat, you would raise your core body temperature almost 8 degrees Celsius in an hour. Okay? 8 degrees Celsius in just an hour. So it's absolutely necessary that we be able to dissipate. The primary way that we do this is via sweating. There is a critical threshold. It's about 37.3 degrees Celsius. When your core body temperature reaches this, the hypothalamus signals your sweat glands and says, make sweat so we can start evaporative cooling. Okay? This threshold can be altered by training, especially if you train when it's hot outside, you become what we call acclimatized. We'll get into that a little bit in a few slides. Okay? So as core temperature increases in relation to exercise in temperature, exercise intensity, okay, that rise tends to be independent of ambient temperature, but it is dependent upon work rate. So there's a relatively constant rise in core temp. It's all about how much work you're doing. It's very little to do with what the actual air temperature is. You can raise your core body temperature a lot when it's cold outside. It's not a problem. The big issue is going to be what is our ability to get rid of that excess heat. Okay. Okay. Data that are older than me. Okay. Some of the first data here is a measure of rectal core body temperature and relative percentage of VO2 max. And you guys will note there's this relatively linear increase in core body temperature as you exercise at higher and higher intensities. And this tends to be relatively constant among people, okay? It can be off a little bit based upon sort of body surface area to weight and those things, but for the most part, this is relatively constant. What I want all of you guys to see, though, is what happens up here, okay? We are able, for short bursts, to push and clear core body temperature over 40 degrees Celsius. Okay. If that happens for very long, problems can ensue. Okay. Problems can ensue. Okay. I have this slide in here. Okay. But I don't like it, which means I should probably either fix it or take it out. But what I want to show from all of this, okay, is because of the phenomenon of cardiovascular drift, okay, because of cardiovascular drift, when we exercise when it's hot out, okay, when it's hot, over time at the same exact work rate, you're going to have a higher or elevated VO2, sometimes, not always, but sometimes. You're going to have an elevated heart rate, and you're likely going to make more blood lactate. Okay. Part of this is because, okay, it costs us extra energy to dissipate the heat. We are shunting blood away from the muscles out to the skin, so there's less oxygen there, which is going to artificially lower our VO2 max, lowers preload, so stroke volume goes down. That's why heart rate goes up. And for the most part, because there's less oxygen going to the muscles, we may be a little bit more anaerobic. We may make a little bit more lactate. Okay. I don't love the way these look, but I made these myself, and I can't find these graphs to show what I really, really want. But I just want you all to just have a little bit of an idea of what is happening. And because of all of these things, that's why when you exercise and it's hot, you feel worse, right? It feels harder because it is physiologically more taxing to do that when it's hot, okay? My dad, the marathon runner, would always go to a race in June in Duluth, Minnesota. You guys might know where Duluth is? You might know how far north Duluth is? It's not quite to Canada, but we're getting close. and it sits right on Lake Superior. And he would go and run that race in order to try to get a time to qualify to run the Boston Marathon. Okay. They have these set times, you have to make a certain time in order to qualify. And they would go to Duluth because it was flat, and you ran out along the lake, got to the place, turned around, and ran back in, so there were no turns. So it's flat, there's no turns, that makes it faster. And because it was usually about, like today, outside in the first week of June when they would run. And he would always say, and there's a lot of evidence, that somewhere in the high 30s, right around to the low 40s, is fairly optimal for our ability for the environment to pull heat away from us, okay, from a sweating standpoint, and then you can be relatively thermoneutral by doing all of this. It's better to sort of run races when it's a little bit cool than it is even what you might think of as pleasant at like 65 or 60 or something. Okay. Okay, I'll run through a couple of heat disorders, then we'll talk about acclimatization. Two things are going to happen, okay? And they're both going to have an effect on these disorders, but which one is going on and which one plays a role is going to be a little bit different. So, increases in core temp can freak the brain out and cause some processes to switch around and shut down. But the other thing that happens is to get to that place, oftentimes you've sweated a bunch, and therefore you can no longer regulate core body temp via evaporative sweat. So, the least bad heat disorder is something called heat cramps. Okay, this very likely occurs because of sweat loss. Okay, because of dehydration. Okay, and so we can generally treat heat cramps with fluid and say saline. Okay, drink some Gatorade, have an IV bag, something like that, and you should generally be okay. Okay. Long duration, more than say an hour and a half or 2 hours in a relatively hot environment where you run around and you sweat a lot, you can get heat cramps. Okay, it's mostly due to dehydration. The brain is not really freaked out. You've not really been above that core temp very long. That can be kind of the least bad of these things. Okay, the next one is something called heat exhaustion. This one's worse, but it is oftentimes at least not fatal. Okay, with heat exhaustion, you have fatigue, right? What you would perceive as being exhausted, right? Lots of central fatigue, but it may be accompanied with dizziness, vomiting, fainting. You're more often with this one kind of cold and clammy. Okay, you could be hot and dry, but it's more so cold and clammy, and you have low blood pressure and a correspondingly kind of weak and rapid pulse. Okay, you are dehydrated, your plasma volume is down, your stroke volume is down, that drops blood pressure, that drops stroke volume, so your heart rate has to go up. Okay, you're cold and clammy very often because you're still at least able to sweat. Okay, you're still trying to get the right signal out to the periphery to make these things happen, but because of the dehydration and some of the effects in the brain, you may very much feel dizzy, and you may lose kind of balance in those things and feel like vomiting, and you may faint from kind of hypertension. Okay? Oftentimes, the regulatory mechanisms can't dissipate heat fast enough because we can't get enough blood to escape. Okay? You're still able to get some, so you're still able to sweat. You've not kind of freaked the system out entirely. Oftentimes, we treat heat exhaustion by cooling people off, elevating feet to try to help venous return and get heart rate down and blood pressure up, and then we have to push fluids. Okay? Sometimes people will become unconscious. We've got to check what these things are going to look like. Okay? That's heat exhaustion. The worst of all of them, though, is something called a heat stroke. So when internal body temp is over 40 degrees Celsius for a prolonged period of time, one of the things that may happen is the hypothalamus shuts down and you stop sweating. Okay, you stop sweating. So you're already too hot, and then you rid yourself of one of your primary mechanisms of getting rid of heat, and so it can really accelerate very, very quickly. Okay, people having heat stroke are going to be noted by hot and dry skin. They're not sweating. Okay, Rapid pulse, they tend to have the opposite effect. They're not hypotensive, they're hypertensive. Okay? They can be very confused and they can become unconscious. And what happens is that we basically completely switched around the thermoregulatory mechanisms. The hypothalamus is no longer functioning properly in order to send signals to regulate and try to cool yourself off. Okay? Things that increase your risk of heat stroke. People die from this. Unfortunately, very often is football players that die from this every year. Okay, it's exacerbated by increasing weight. Okay, surface area to body weight ratio. So how much body surface area you have, how much skin you can expose to a cool environment, skin you have to sweat versus your body weight is really important. The larger you are, especially from a BMI standpoint, the increase, so the worse at dissipating heat you are. Okay, it's often not associated with extreme conditions. This tends to happen. It happens in football because they wear pads, all of these things. It's not quite super duper hot out. They don't drink enough fluids. It especially happens in offensive and defensive linemen because they have the smaller surface area to body weight ratio. They're not as good at dissipating heat. Okay, and they go too long and it kind of catches up on you and you begin to shut down before you even realize what has happened. When I was in high school, we had a kid at one of our junior highs that died from this, the year that I was a senior. And so it has changed. We've gotten way better at this. I think, I don't know if there are rules in Oklahoma, but in Arkansas, it's a state law that like you have to have a wet bulb globe thermometer, and there's ranges, and if the wet bulb globe is over a certain amount, then you can't practice outside on those days, or if you do practice outside, it can only be for a certain amount of time, and you can't practice with full pads and things in an effort to try. Because you put all the pads and stuff on, you make more heat because you got to carry them, but then they also get soaked with sweat, so it's harder for things to dissipate. So we try to monitor this way better, but it's still sometimes a problem. Okay, so just things to keep in mind and to be aware of. Okay, so how do we avoid any of these heat illnesses? Well, don't exercise with a wet bulb temperature above about 28 degrees Celsius. Okay, which the big driver of all of that is when it's a certain temperature outside and a certain humidity, that's when things can be the most dangerous. Okay, practice in the morning, practice at night. Okay, try to practice when it's windy or something, that would be better. Wear a lightweight, light-colored, loosely woven clothing. Expose as much skin as possible. The more skin that's exposed, the easier it is to evaporate. Okay, you have a shirt on and you sweated through the shirt or something, and it sits on you, and there's lots of water sitting on top of your skin that's sweating, and it reduces the gradient and makes it much more difficult for it to evaporate. Okay. The other big thing is just drink plenty of fluids. Okay. As a generation, we look around at all of you guys. Y'all are probably better hydrated than a lot of the rest of us. Okay. You drink a lot more water or fluids, but when you're going to do stuff outside, it's really important that we push as much fluid as possible. Okay. Okay. Let me talk very briefly here at the end about the process of what we call acclimatization. Acclimatization is, in essence, training yourself to be better at exercising in the heat, or training yourself to be better at removing heat that is made during exercise. Okay, there are some physiological adaptations that occur that will improve work capacity and reduce thermal stress during exercise. Primary things that change are sweating occurs at a lower core body temperature. We have a lot of evidence that you don't actually sweat more when you're acclimatized, you just sweat sooner. Okay? Sweat sooner. That's going to then lead to lower core and skin temps. You also are going to have this increase in plasma volume that's going to occur That increase in plasma volume means I've got more sweat that I can lose, more plasma I can lose, which is then going to help prevent a decrease in heart rate. And it's also going to help kind of keep our core temps a little bit more in check. Okay. So what do you need to do to become acclimatized? It's relatively simple. You just got to go walk around when it's hot. Okay. It takes about 10 days of prolonged daily exposure, so an hour to 2 hours, okay, to heat while doing some kind of exercise that likely is in the range of walking to a light jog. So like 35 to 50% of VO2 max is generally sufficient. Okay. There is some evidence that you can just go sit in the sauna for an hour and you can get some acclimatization from all of that as well. Okay. So one of the key things, this is why there is oftentimes like a week of sort of practices for sports that start of sort of fall semester. You start in August and you have like a week where you don't have all your pads on, and you have a week where you don't scrimmage. You're just out there to try to get acclimated because it can get us at least halfway towards some of these adaptations. Okay. So we alter the threshold temperature, so sweating begins at lower core body temperature. So you go from sweating at 37.3 to you sweat at 37.1. Okay. So the hypothalamus senses a change in core temp and it turns on the sweat gland sooner. And that hopefully tries to head off some of the bigger increase in core temp. Okay. We're also going to increase skin flow at lower core temps as well. Okay. So we're going to get more heat loss when we combine with increased sweating and those things. So we're going to try to turn all the things that are going to help us dissipate on sooner, so we don't wait until we get closer to 40 degrees Celsius before all of that happens. Okay. So the other big thing is that you see about a 25% increase in your plasma volume in about 10 days. A lot of this is driven by aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone stimulation, but you hold on to plasma volume. Okay. And you expand your plasma volume. It's going to be really beneficial. So if you train to be an endurance athlete in the heat, it increases your blood volume. And then you go and you compete in a thermoneutral environment or a cold environment, and now you have that extra blood volume. It's going to make you keep your stroke volume up, keep your VO2 max up. Okay. So very important types of things that are going to happen because of all of this. Okay. Okay. So remember that I told you guys that we had a lab that did a lot of crazy stuff in investigating thermal stress at Georgia when I was there. These are not data from that particular lab, but they did experiments like that. Here's the response to 4 hours of exercise in humid heat before and after acclimatization to that heat and humidity. So these people are riding the bike for 4 straight hours. Okay. I don't think I ever did one way more than like we did 2 hours and then a VO2 max test at the end. It was still terrible. Okay. But you start off, here is unacclimated, here is acclimated in the dark closed circles. And this is just very simply rectal body temperature over 4 hours. Okay. You will note how it is lower at every sort of time point once you become acclimated. It's the exact same amount of work in the exact same thermal environment. Okay. You can see the heart rate in the middle. You've got lower heart rates. That preservation of plasma volume or expansion of plasma volume keeps stroke volume from falling so much, which allows heart rate to be lower. And then you're going to see basically they were measuring sweat rate. Okay, here I know in the previous slide I told you the acclimatization doesn't have a lot of sweat rate effects. That's from other experiments. They saw a little bit of an increase in rate here, where it was a little bit better after acclimatization. Generally, we think that's not the case, although in this particular group of people, it was. Okay. All right. So this is some better data on the sweat rate from the same guys, but in a different thing. Here is your rate of sweating when you're acclimated and not acclimated. Okay. And what they had people do was they just said, you're gonna go exercise, you're gonna go as long as you can go. And when you stop exercising, we're gonna figure out what your core body temperature is. And so I want you guys to note that both of these people stopped somewhere around 40 degrees Celsius. The slopes are roughly the same, okay? Which tells us that sweat rate is roughly the same, but it just gets turned on a little bit sooner here. Okay, when you're acclimatized. Okay, we will stop there. We'll clean up the last couple of slides on Wednesday. We'll have our quiz on this to start Wednesday, and we'll do some body pump stuff, and we'll call it a semester. Please turn in your assignment.